I've played a lot of Cooking Mama, and if I had to make chicken Kiev from scratch, I think I would cry.
Hello, fellow netizens, and welcome to Scandalous Games, the show where we take a closer look at video game-related controversies. I'm Kevin Impellizeri, and I do the research and share a story of a video game-related controversy to my friends.
Hi, my name's Phil, and you might as well consider me a video game newbie.
I'm Kate. I've been writing software for over a decade, but not the fun kind.
And here we are back again for another installment of our look at Killology expert Dave Grossman. Last time, we talked about his big break as a video game expert, talking about a mass shooting in Jonesboro, Arkansas in 1998 that just happened to happen in Dave Grossman's hometown, which then became a jumping off point where he got a bunch of press exposure and a lot of repetition of his, killological philosophy. And then this carried over into later school shootings between 1998 and 1999, to the point that by the Columbine shooting in April 1999, Grossman had basically elevated to his final form as a self-proclaimed video game expert. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to start looking into how he approached his crusade against video games. And so how did the self-proclaimed killology expert take on the violent video game menace? And Grossman waged his war on the dangerous effects of Hexen Beyond Heretic on three fronts, which he described during a 1999 congressional hearing as education, legislation, and litigation. And that three-pronged attack is what we're going to cover here. So today, we're going to examine Grossman's approach on these three fronts. We'll examine his tactics and see some of the people he viewed as allies and or lieutenants in his war on the likes of Carmageddon, several of whom have made regular past appearances on this show. And my hope is by the end that you'll see how Grossman is in many respects the phantom menace of the violent video game debate, influencing how we have thought about video game violence as a political and public health issue into the present day. And the more I researched, the more I saw how Dave's philosophy and ideas have permeated into a lot of what we think about in violent video games. So that's what we're going to do today. How's everybody doing?
Good. By the Phantom Menace, do you mean that he gets decapitated at the end after like a 5 to 7 minute battle? Or wait, was somebody else the Phantom Menace in that movie?
I believe Darth Sidious, not Darth Tyrannus, was the Phantom Menace. And no, he does not get decapitated.
Oh, I did not know that. I was like, when the guy got decapitated, I'm like, well, that was a short prequel.
All right, let's dive into it then. Let's start with education. And Grossman had a lot of methods at his disposal for spreading his gospel on the hazards of redneck rampage on America's youth. And these included producing and promoting his various terrible books like On Killing, On Combat, Assassination Generation, and Stop Teaching Our Kids to Kill. There were also his interactions with the press, who pretty much gave him carte blanche to peddle his alleged facts about operant conditioning, murder simulators, and absurdly low World War II firing rates through pull quotes and sound bites, or, just straight up hosting them on their shows. He also had his business as a law enforcement trainer and motivational speaker, where he warns everyone willing to give him money that the real threat to life and civil order is the likes of Duke Nukem 3D, a topic we'll explore in more detail in our final episode. So again, a little bit of context, Phil, that we set up that in 1998, Grossman finally retires as a member of the U.S. Army, and he leaves his post at Arkansas State University to form his own think tank called the Killology Research Group.
A question. How many people ended up being in that think tank?
I don't know. It's hard to say because there's the Killology Research Group, there's the Dave Grossman Academy, and there's a couple of other extended business ventures, which eventually when Grossman establishes himself as a police trainer, he ends up having a team of his own people who basically repeat his message at these things. So I'm actually not sure how big his operation is. It definitely has a huge reach.
Okay, because I was picturing it more as a think unicycle.
It's just him.
Just him in a phone booth.
Yeah, the Killology Research Group, our world headquarters, are my kitchen table. Which actually, incidentally, is the way Jack Thompson used to describe his legal office. There's an article that he did in the Los Angeles Times. Well, it was an interview of him in the Los Angeles Times in the early 1990s when he was going at Two Live Crew, where he described his office, and it's just literally his kitchen table with a picture of Batman magneted on the refrigerator because, again, Jack Thompson thought he was Batman. It's not sad.
Well, at least we have desks with cameras, so we're doing better than Jack Thompson.
Jack's going to news people, please don't tell people how I live. All right, so on top of starting his own business into killology and video game violence, Dave Grossman surrounded himself with other like-minded members of the media activist community. And ever since the moral panic of the early 1990s, it created the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, which you can learn about in our previous 4-part series. There emerged a group of media watchdogs determined to monitor the ways the games industry regulated its own content, usually coming to the conclusion that the games industry couldn't be trusted and the ESRB should be replaced with a privately run rating system and/or video game content should be regulated by the government. For example, one notable group was the National Institute on Media and the Family. We've kind of mentioned them in passing a number of times on this show, and we may be doing a whole episode on them at some point. Founded in 1996 by a Minnesota-based child psychologist named David Walsh, the National Institute on Media and the Family was a research and lobbying organization designed to warn parents and politicians of the hazardous effects of violent media. NIMF, which I'm going to call them that. I don't know if they called themselves that, but I'm going to call them NIMF. NIMF was an active player in the violent video games discussion up until their folding in 2009, and they produced print and online material warning parents about the potentially negative influences of various forms of media. They were also extremely active in Washington, and Dr. Walsh managed to ingratiate himself and his organization with various federal lawmakers. For example, during our collective public freakout over hot coffee, which if you'll recall was a scrapped sex-based minigame left in the code of the retail versions of Grand Theft Auto San Andreas that a small group of hackers managed to access via mods and cheat devices, on July the 14th, 2005, U.S. Senator Hillary Clinton held a press conference where she demanded a full federal investigation into whether Rockstar misled the ESRB with its cut content that only could be accessed through unauthorized circumvention of video game hardware and software. That is to say, super easy, according to them.
As a short plug, can I just say that's easily the best episode of this podcast?
It is a lot of fun. I do have fond memories of doing that with you all. It's got everything you need. It's got like corporate hubris, lots of lies as people tried to backpedal what happened. It's got, the freakouts of moral crusaders. It's got Jack Thompson. It's got everybody. Check that out in our back catalog if you haven't listened to it. But accompanying Hillary Clinton at that press conference was David Walsh, who warned against the game's quote-unquote hidden pornographic content. Is that, Phil, is that one of the episodes you nominated us for a Pulitzer Prize for?
Oh, that's right. We have been nominated for a Pulitzer. Yes, it's that and the chip shortage because I like attention.
Yeah, Scandalous Games news here. I kind of buried the lead. I should have done this at the beginning. I think it's because I'm still waking up. But we are now a Pulitzer Prize nominated show. Mostly because Phil is a very nice holiday present, nominated us for 2 Pulitzer Prizes.
You know what's hilarious? When I finally broke the news to Kevin had the same idea. I had just beaten him by a few days.
Yeah, I was planning to nominate us for a Pulitzer Prize when the Grossman series was over. But yeah, so now we can say, like Dave Grossman, we are also Pulitzer Prize nominated.
That's right. We're going toe-to-toe with Dave Grossman. You've got a Pulitzer nomination, probably. We have a Pulitzer nomination. Definitely.
That sounded like the opening of a wrestling challenge.
Oh, yeah.
March 5th at WrestleMania, you, me, Dave Grossman in the ring. Hell in a Cell. I will only do Hell in a Cell.
And then see Truckosaurus and Sergeant Slaughter and his battle battalion.
Listen, folks, you're going to pay $25 for the whole seat, but you're only going to need the edge.
Oh, I forgot all about that.
Come on down this Sunday. Sunday. We've already fallen completely off the rails here. So back to NIMF, the National Institute of Media and the Family. So again, they're one of these media activist groups that props up after the moral panic over violent video games in the early 1990s. There are a couple of other organizations that do this, but they're kind of one of the more influential ones because of how much reach they had among DC lawmakers. Because NIMF also hosted an annual publicity stunt in Washington where they revealed their annual report card on the video games industry, which they assessed with letter grades how accurately the ESRB rating system reflected a game's content, how well the industry was informing parents about the rating system, and how well retailers were enforcing it. And the signature piece of this event was something they called the Media-Wise Games to Avoid, which was an annual list of what the Institute viewed as the most morally objectionable games of the previous year. NIMF also put out research investigating both the effects of violent media on children and the efficacy of the various industry rating systems, including the ESRB, the MPAA film rating system, and the recording industry's parental advisory label, and eventually coming to the conclusion that all of the systems were useless and needed to be replaced, ideally by one created or endorsed by the National Institute on Media and the Family, because if you're an interest group and the research doesn't somehow benefit you personally, you're doing it wrong. Yeah, there's something, and we've covered in the past how, as the years went on, they got increasingly petty and very personal against the industry. They eventually called the ESRB broken beyond repair. And they worked with a lot of organizations over the years to try to develop a privately run rating system. So in many ways, creating a system that they would directly benefit from.
Dude, that's so trite. I bet they do self-aggrandizing things like, I don't know, nominate themselves for awards that other people should be nominating them for, and talking themselves up on a podcast, and you know, we would never do anything like that.
Perish the thought, we would never do that. Niff and David Walsh had some pretty close ties to Dave Grossman. Dave was a frequent guest at public appearances held by the organization. For example, in February 1999, NIMF, in cooperation with a group called Ground Zero Minnesota, sponsored a series of talks by the self-proclaimed killologist at several venues, including churches and schools in the Twin Cities area. Dave also relied pretty heavily on institute-backed research to provide an academic justification for the various wild claims he made in his books. And if you peruse his citations in books such as Assassination Generation and Stop Teaching Our Kids to Kill, you'll find more than a few articles published by either Walsh or the Institute's director of research, a guy named Douglas Gentile, who was a professor of psychology at Iowa State University. What's also interesting about examining Grossman's relationship with various media activist organizations is we got a clear picture of where Dave fits into the larger American political scene. And they say you can judge a person by the company they keep, and in the case of the foremost expert in a field that he made up, Dave seems to really like associating with fundamentalist and evangelical Christian organizations and the violent media is harming our children worse than any gun possibly could type crowd. And it's important to acknowledge that despite the media presenting Grossman as a rational, level-headed academic, Dave is clearly part of an aggressive, politically active Christian right that wants to bend modern American society to a specific view of the world. Yeah, he's one of those types. For example, on October the 14th, 1999, following the publication of Stop Teaching Our Kids to Kill, Grossman hosted a press event in D.C. in which he invited federal lawmakers to join him, quote, to call for an end to the excessive violence by the entertainment industry, end quote. His invitation included a lengthy guest list of representatives of several other media watchdog groups, namely Concerned Women of America, the Traditional Values Coalition, the Family Research Council, the Parents Television Council, the Church of the Brethren, and the Lion and Lamb Project. And with that, I have a fun game I want to play with you two. Of those 6 organizations I just named, let's take a guess how many of them have been classified as hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And here's a hint, it's not 0.
Can I get the names of the organizations again?
They were Concerned Women of America, the Traditional Values Coalition, the Family Research Council, the Parents Television Council, the Church of the Brethren, and the Lion and Lamb Project.
I'm going to say 4 of the 6.
Okay, so Kate says 4. What do you think, Phil?
Let's see. Out of those 6, I would have to say 7.
So another one just jumped on.
That's right. There's another one that's related that you haven't mentioned. That is also a hate group.
Using the wrestling analogy, they had their public event and then the lights went dark, the whole room filled with smoke, and another organization comes running into the ring. All right, so good guesses. I think that based on the names of those organizations, based on who Dave is, those are pretty sound guesses. The correct answer is 2. 2 that I know of, definitely. Those are the Traditional Values Coalition and the Family Research Council. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, which follows and raises awareness of hate groups, the Traditional Values Coalition was founded in 1980 by a Presbyterian minister and a protege of known super laid-back and very tolerant guy, Pat Robertson, named Lewis Sheldon, who vehemently opposed LGBTQ plus rights, even calling for people with AIDS to be confined to leper colonies. When his daughter Andrea Lafferty took over running the group in the 2000s, she branched out, expanding the group's reach to include hating Muslims as well. The Family Research Council, meanwhile, was also founded in 1980 as an offshoot of Focus on the Family, another religious conservative hate group, by the way, eventually becoming its own organization in 1992.
Right, this is legit me pleading ignorance here. Focus on the Family is officially qualifies as a hate group. Does not shock me. I just remember listening to the radio when I was a kid, programs brought to you by Focus on the Family, so that's interesting.
Hey there, fellow netizens. This is Kevin Indie Editor here with a brief correction here. Focus on the Family is avowedly anti-LGBTQ plus rights. However, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, they are not designated as a hate group. Just wanted to make that brief correction, because as Kit asked that question, I initially answered it as yes, they are. But no, they are not designated as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. Apologies for the error, and back to the show.
like its parent organization, the folks at the Family Research Council really don't like gay and trans people and have spent the last 4 decades demonizing LGBTQ plus people, putting out garbage studies supporting their hateful worldview, and calling for people to have fewer rights in defense of religious freedom. You know, the kinds of people crying groomer and using protecting the innocence of children as a smokescreen to promulgate their hatred of people who aren't them. And Dave clearly didn't have a problem with that since he invited these guys to help promote his book. He was also a regular speaker for the Schiller Institute's Commission to Stop the New Violence, a commission created by conspiracy theory monger Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who, as we learned in our Pokemon Fan Project series, has some strong opinions on those pesky pocket monsters, on top of being married to noted fascist Lyndon LaRouche. Listen, just because all of my friends are fundamentalist Christians trying to take away people's rights or outright fascists, that doesn't mean I am. I'm just okay with that.
In my mind, I'm trying to go through the number of like fascist adjacent conservatives that have been famous in America over the past 20 to 30 years. And I'm trying to think of the ones you haven't mentioned yet to see if I can guess which ones are about to come up.
We're not going to cover this in a lot of detail today, but the more I look at the rogues gallery we've built upon this show, it's amazing how few steps you go from people like Dave to outright fascists. It's kind of impressive.
Will we get to Jerry Falwell?
No Jerry today. A lot of these groups, though, are pretty close to Jerry. In addition to associating with some biased or outright hateful organizations who believe that not only is media dangerous, but everyone would be a whole lot better off without all these pesky civil rights, Dave has also taken to making some of his own research into the alleged harmful effects of the likes of mixed up Mother Goose. As we covered in our episode on violent video game research, one of the side effects of the Columbine shooting was it helped transform the effects of video game violence for what had been up to that point a relatively niche topic in academia into a full-blown subject field of its own. And there was an explosion in papers alleging that there was a definitive link between playing violent video games and mass death events like those that occurred at Heath High School, Westside Middle School, and Columbine. However, not to spoil too much from our previous episode, on the whole, the papers that make these kinds of claims suffer from numerous issues, such as conflating violence with aggression, relying heavily on anecdotal evidence, and self-reported data. So, like, for example, a person says how much they play video games and then offers what crimes they may have committed in a survey, all shared by the person, and overstating their results. And on top of that, we learned that a lot of the research claiming there's a proven link between violent video games and violent behavior comes from a small handful of researchers who almost exclusively cite each other or themselves and dismiss any critics of their work as being shills of the video game industry. And if you see the names Craig Anderson, L. Raoul Huseman, Brad Bushman, Douglas Gentile, or Gene Funk, chances are you're going to find tons of citations in their papers referencing each other. And Dave Grossman, the deep and discerning researcher that he is, basically only cites from these people if he cites anyone at all. I think a great way of illustrating the way a lot of the violent video games cause harm research is there's a scene in Rick and Morty. They go to like the couples counseling thing and there's like all the avatar representations of Jerry. And in the corner, there's one of it where it's different Jerrys just shaking hands with each other. That's kind of the way I think of the violent video game research. It's a bunch of the same guys just citing each other, just patting each other on the back kind of thing. Conversely, a lot of those same scholars like to cite Grossman's research as further proof of the insidious effects of video games, further proving my point that a huge amount of the violent video games research crowd is just one massive circle jerk. It's just the same guys, again, patting each other on the back, citing each other, and it's like Dave Grossman says that video games cause violence, and I'm Craig Anderson to emphasize that, and then Dave Grossman sees Craig Anderson's citation of him and cites it as his example, and like back and forth we go.
And if you want to see more examples of video game violence, check out Fat Roll Gaming on YouTube.
Still playing Armored Core?
No, I kind of I got to a level in New Game Plus that I couldn't get past, and then I was like, I've suddenly decided for some reason that I'm tired of this game.
At some point, we got to go back to the Lands Between and do another run through Elden Ring, I think.
Oh, yeah, the DLC's coming out, right?
Yeah, eventually. I don't know when, but yeah. So like I said, a lot of these guys citing each other. So for example, in 2002, while serving as an expert witness during Interactive Digital Software v. St. Louis County, Missouri, which was one of several federal court cases addressing the legality of laws restricting access to video games, Craig Anderson, who is a professor of psychology at Iowa State University and someone who creates a lot of this research, cited Grossman directly, claiming that video games are, quote, killing simulators, end quote. And in light of this, in addition to exclusively citing people who reinforce his worldview, like Craig Anderson and the folks at the National Institute of Meaning and the Family, Grossman also possibly got into creating some research of his own. To that end, allow me to briefly introduce you to Vincent Matthews. Vincent Matthews is a former associate professor of clinical psychology at Indiana University School of Medicine, and he's currently the chair of the Department of Radiology at the Medical College of Wisconsin. He's a pretty well-known person in the radiological field. During the 2000s and into the early 2010s, Matthews and several of his colleagues at Indiana University began examining the impact of media violence on the brain. Their first study, titled Media Violence Exposure and Executive Functioning in Aggressive and Control Adolescents, appeared in the June 2005 edition of the Journal of Clinical Psychology. The two-part study involved examining 54 young people between the ages of 13 and 17, half of whom had been diagnosed with a disruptive behavioral disorder, while the other half had no diagnosed disorders and acted as a control group. In the first half, the subjects underwent a psychological evaluation where they, stop me if you've heard this one, self-reported their violent media exposure, both TV and video games, over the past week and the past year, comparing that data with what their parents reported over the same time period. So again, we're already getting the thing that's in a lot of these researches where we're self-reporting our violent content. It's why don't you tell me how violent your video games are? And then I'll build my study around that. In the second part, the subjects participated in tests designed to measure cognition in certain parts of the brain, and researchers compared the results between these two groups and subjects whom the researchers found to have high exposure to media violence and those who had low exposure. They ultimately concluded that there was reason to believe there was a relationship between media exposure and deficits in frontal lobe function, reasoning that people with personality disorders tend to have diminished executive function, and their subjects who have personality disorders tend to be exposed to more violent media. Therefore, violent video games reduce executive function. So it's kind of like video games are harmful by the transitive property. So we have a lot of people whose executive function seems to be compromised in such a way, and they just happen to play video games. So it must be, they must connect.
All right, I'm gonna need you to take me through that one more time. Like take us through what were those three relationships again?
So again, they were looking at their two pools of subjects were young people aged 13 and 17. Roughly half of them had a diagnosed personality disorder.
Yeah.
And the other half did not have a diagnosed personality disorder. And again, they self-reported how much media exposure they had. And they compared that to their parents. And so they compared the people who had personality disorders versus those who didn't and compared their media exposure, particularly, their violent media exposure. And then they had them do a series of psychological tests. So there's a test called a Stroop test, which, if I'm remembering correctly, is basically you're given a card, and it's got the names of colors, red, blue, purple, yellow. But the font color is a different color. So it's like it says the word blue, but it's red font. And what they measure is that people have to identify identify all the colors you see, identify the words you see. And they use that as a measure of executive function and reasoning. And what they did is they would do that with people, and then they would have them go through an MRI machine to measure what parts of the brain are kind of active at that point. And what they basically said was that there was a link between, it was kind of like I've seen the images that they produced. There's basically they say the pathways that lead to the high executive functioning people on people who self-reported they were playing video games are different than the ones that aren't, and suggesting that basically means that their conclusion with that was that basically violent media impedes the parts of your brain responsible for executive function. Does that make sense?
Okay, it does. Thank you for taking me through that. And can I just point out, we all play video games and we've been nominated for a Pulitzer. Okay. How about that for executive function?
Yeah.
As a side note, I played a card game called Stroop that is basically that test. Kev, you might remember it was at a friend's function. That's just a really hard game, regardless of anything else. That's a really challenging thing to do.
Yeah, it does kind of mess with your head. It's like, I remember going to, when I was starting out and trying to get into a career, I remember trying to apply for an insurance firm, and they, for some reason, had a very long math test as part of the application. And you never feel more stupid and self-conscious when you're a grown adult trying to sort through math problems and trying to do that to get a job. And it's like, what? Okay, how do I do this in such a way that I don't think my brain doesn't work?
Be counting on your fingers under the table.
Kate, was that Stroop based on Stroop waffles?
I wish. I think it's just the same name.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a pretty common psychological test.
Yeah, and the card game I'm talking about, I think it's literally called Stroop, which I believe it's out of print now, or at least I can't find a copy of it.
I'm going to look it up while you're talking about it.
It's basically everybody has to put out a card from their hand that is related to the card played before it. So if I put out the word green written in blue on a card, then you might have a blue triangle, and then I might have a word written in a circle that says triangle, and so on. But it really breaks your brain after a while. I remember there were several times where we're like, wait, why did you play that card? What does that have to do with the other card? It's like, nothing. Now that I'm looking at this, no.
I just looked it up on Board Game Geek. Here's the description of Stroop. Stroop is a real-time observation game based on the psychological Stroop effect, which is a phenomenon caused by different functions of the brain interfering with one another. The cards in Stroop each display a single word. The words are printed in several colors: black, red, blue, and yellow, sizes, big and little, and styles, hollow and solid. And they have different numbers of letters, 3, 4, 5, and 6. The challenge is to read one word and quickly match it with a description of another word without regard to what the second word says. In the first round of the game, players are dealt an equal number of cards, and a card is turned face up in the center of the table, forming the base of a pile. Players then race to find a card in their deck that the center card describes, and this places on top of the pile, changing the center card. Play continues until one player runs out of cards. The second round of the game is similar to the first, except that the rule for eligible cards to play is reversed. Now a card may be played only if its text describes the qualities of the card in the center. The player with the fewest cards remaining wins. So it's a little bit like what we talked about with the brain studies. And what they do is they put people in an MRI, and they see what the kind of neural pathways that causes. This is common actually in a bunch of other media violence studies where people try to argue that exposure to this or that thing is impeding those neural pathways. That's a lot of Vincent Matthews' bag, and it's a lot of the people who are working at Indiana University at this time. And they actually did a number of these studies. So they published another study in 2005 in the May-June 2005 edition of the Journal of Computer-Assisted Tomography, where they put subjects through an fMRI machine and concluded that there was a link between media violence exposure and altered brain activity. And every so often after 2005, Matthews and his team would put out more studies along these lines, claiming that violent video games led to diminished activity in the frontal lobes of the brain. And again, that's the section responsible for executive function, which is personality, social behavior, and mood. Yeah, Phil.
Sorry, what was that publication again? It sounded like something that wasn't complete bullshit.
The Journal of Computer-Assisted Tomography.
Okay, what is tomography?
Tomography is marvelous Kevin Googles in real time. Tomography is a technique for displaying a representation of a cross-section through the human body or other solid objects using X-rays. So like when you see brain scans, that's a tomography.
Oh,
It
okay.
does look it does look like a real journal, actually. I'm looking it up now.
Yeah.
As far as I know, this journal is legit and it's peer-reviewed. I've read the article. The thing about a lot of these articles arguing the link of video games in aggression or violence is that they tend to couch a lot of their conclusions, basically saying, there might be a link, there might be this thing. They're alleging a causation, but they're not making a lot of dramatic claims. And what's really interesting about that is in stark contrast to the press releases they put out about these things, because it's often about, I've seen a couple of these where it's like, Indiana University has proven the link between video game violence and poor adolescent brain development. And these are definitely a testimony to the way the media covers science, because they want big dramatic conclusions and they kind of play up the big dramatic conclusions. But it also works out for Matthews and his team because it means that they might get more grant money because they're being seen as a leading expert in this field.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say the reason some of these institutions would do those studies is just because, irrespective of the result, they know they will be covered.
I've got to imagine that's the case. And like a lot of what universities build themselves on is, centers of foundations of learning and research. And so if you can corner the research and say we are the leading experts in talking about a specific topic like video game violence, then that's a big deal because it can result in, for example, more fundraising, more grants, and of course enhancing the prestige of your college. And like I said, every so often Matthews would put out these kinds of studies talking about the relationship of adolescent brain function and video games. For example, they put out an article in the April the 30th, 2011 edition of Psychiatry Research Neuroimaging and the July 2014 edition of Brain and Cognition. They also presented several studies at annual meetings of the Radiological Society of North America, which were then covered in the popular press, which eagerly and crucially without reading the studies, declared that scientists had finally found the definitive link between video game violence and real-world violence that moral crusaders have been searching for. So they do this a number of different times where they're making these really bold claims in the press that they don't really align with the actual research they're doing. Because as far as I can tell, of the presentations, particularly the ones where they make the biggest claims, where they're presenting at this conference and they're making this huge claim, the definitive link, as far as I can tell, reading through Matthews' CV, which is, his record of his publications, those don't translate into peer-reviewed articles. So it sounds like he's presenting and making big dramatic claims and then not following through with them, because that would involve peer review and that would involve scrutiny of his data. So for example, he presented studies at the 2007 and 2011 meetings of that organization. However, they don't seem to match any of his list of published articles that he has on his bio with the Medical College of Wisconsin. And going through the studies he did publish, I saw a lot of the issues we covered in our past episodes on violent video game research. So, go ahead and check that out for a closer look at the ways people have argued for the harmful effects of, Clay Fighter and whatnot. For now, I'll just say the studies done by Matthews and his colleagues from this layperson's perspective. They tend to draw large conclusions from really small sample sizes. Most of their research is done involving studies of fewer than 60 people, and they really don't do an effective job of making a clear correlation between playing violent video games and any kind of antisocial behavior. Are people behaving or committing more violent acts because this part of the brain is lit up during a Stroop test as opposed to this other part? And another thing which we covered in our violent video game research episode is that these studies, they don't cover violent behavior at all. They cover aggression and enhanced levels of excitement, which you can interpret in a lot of different ways. It's not responsible to say that we have scientific proof that playing video games causes, someone to bludgeon somebody or murder somebody. They don't connect that. Although in the press, when they talk about that, they emphasize that link. And they also, there's kind of a correlation versus causation thing. Are people exposed to violent media because they're violent, or, violent media causing them to be violent? There's a correlation thing. They never really address that, but they really love putting out their flashy press announcements about they finally found that direct link between playing the suffering and committing mass shootings, while also, interestingly, not turning those bold claims into peer-reviewed articles. So I hear you ask them, what do these Indiana University studies have to do with Dave Grossman? And to answer that, we need to look at who happens to be funding these studies. And as it turns out, all of Matthews and Associates' studies on the impact of media violence on young people's brains at Indiana University that I mentioned were paid for through the generous contributions of one organization, the Center for Successful Parenting. Does that name sound familiar to anybody?
Was that one of the two groups that was a hate group?
No.
Does not ring a bell.
Okay. I bring it up because we mentioned them in passing during our violent video game research episode. So I hear you ask them, who was the Center for Successful Parenting? According to the state of Indiana's incorporation records, the Center for Successful Parenting was established on April the 23rd, 1999, interestingly, a mere 3 days after the Columbine shooting. According to their application, and this I got from the State Department, from the state of Indiana. Actually, if you want to look for any nonprofit or corporation, you can search your incorporation records on your respective states. Very cool thing to do. And as a result of that, I was able to see the incorporation paperwork they submitted to the state of Indiana. And according to their application, the organization's goal was twofold. Quote, A, providing parents with educational opportunities, programs, and resources that will assist them in understanding childhood development and the effect that various forms of media can have on that development. And B, educating parents with respect to various techniques and technologies that can be used to monitor and influence their children's exposure to the detrimental effects of media exposure, end quote. So that's what their stated goal is, at least when they apply in Indiana. However, the center's homepage had a much more colorful assessment of their thoughts on the role of media in society. From an October the 23rd, 2002 capture on the organization's website, quote, movie and television violence, along with violent video games and even more violent internet content, are a cancer eating away at the American society. Our nation's children are impacted by media violence in a number of ways. School shootings in Colorado, Kentucky, Arkansas, and dozens of other American communities in recent years typically have one thing in common. Perpetrators told police or left behind writings that showed that they were heavily influenced by the violent acts they absorbed from television, movies, video games, and the internet. America's children live in a society that glorifies violence. If they aren't influenced to commit violence themselves, they live in fear of violent acts by their schoolmates, friends, and neighbors, end quote. So yeah, that all sounds cool and rational. Anybody's thoughts on that?
Can I just point out that you read that in a Jack Thompson voice?
I think it's your natural state at this point.
So yeah, this group seems okay, doesn't it? I don't see any red flags. Maybe their whole motif is a giant red flag. But so yeah, this is the group that funded all these brain studies. And in every one of these, they disclose their financials, where they're getting them from. And Center for Successful Parenting is the sole funder of all of those studies. I mentioned those brain studies. Looking deeper into this organization, the Center for Successful Parenting has some uncomfortably close ties to the self-proclaimed Killology expert. Checking various captures of the center's website, courtesy of the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine, Grossman's oily hands are all over this group. For example, the center's first administrative director was Chris King, who, according to his LinkedIn, is an employee of Dave Grossman, having worked for the last 21 years in Grossman's Killology research group. The center also sold a bunch of Grossman-related products, including both On Killing and Stop Teaching Our Kids to Kill, as well as a video that Grossman's starting called Virus of Violence on their website. The very first link on their list of institutional partners is Grossman's Killology research group, and Dave Grossman is the very first name that comes up on the list of the center's advisory board. So what do we think about this?
Well, the one thought I had was, I mean, so there's a clear connection between Dave Grossman and this organization that's funding research that he's hoping will bear out the outcome that he's looking to promulgate. I guess my question to both of you is how much research is funded like this? Is all of it? Like now I'm just trying to be like, wait a minute, how much research out there is just biased crap? Is it 90%?
I think this is definitely a good case study into looking carefully into science reporting and like, yeah, who's funding this? Who's backing these kinds of things? It's like Pepsi challenge kind of things where it's like, the Pepsi Corporation did a study that found that people like Pepsi over Coke. I don't see any bias there. And some of these organizations that seem to be founded with these sort of self-interested goals in mind. Because what I see is, I cannot 100% prove this, but I think Grossman is behind the whole center. At the very least, we have an interest group funding research that reinforces Grossman's message about the hazardous effects of violent media that is also actively promoting several of Grossman's personal and financial ventures. And that research is something that very much fits into Dave's brand. And as we'll see, when he becomes a motivational speaker, one thing he loves to do is he loves to cite these MRI studies. He will do talks where he'll show pictures of the alleged brain scans. It seems to me that it would appear that this organization, and by extension, Matthews and his colleagues' studies, weren't there to benefit parents, children, or public health at large, but to instead benefit Dave Grossman and his personal brand. I will also point out, though, again, cannot definitively prove that, for example, Dave Grossman financed this organization, and he was not technically a member of this organization. I looked into ProPublica, put out a really fantastic searchable resource of nonprofit organizations. Because nonprofit organizations, by law, have to report their tax reports. And you can go through them and read them, and you can see who is affiliated, what money they raised, where that money went. And I looked through a bunch of the centers. I believe they have them back from starting in 2000. And Grossman is not a staff member officially, but they raise a bunch of money. It doesn't say where they raise the money from. So it's possible that you have Dave backing this program. Or again, at the very least, like it's clearly an organization that is really benefiting this one dude personally. In any case, whatever conflicts of interest you can insinuate from those uncomfortable ties between Grossman and these studies, going forward, Dave certainly saw no ethical issues citing Indiana University's MRI studies in both his future books and his training seminars, while conveniently leaving out his, one would say, compromising personal connections to those studies. He still cites them to this day, and fMRI images with declarations about the hazardous effects of violent media exposure are a mainstay of his police training seminars. And Dave was also not the only person who saw his various studies as useful to the campaign to protect children against the likes of Buck Bumble. That's probably one of the deepest cuts I've made so far in these references.
That went right over my head, by the way.
Buck Bumble was an N64 game.
Okay, that cleared it up. Thank you.
I'm so glad you got that, Kate. I was just like, wait, hold on.
That didn't help.
It's like a third-person shooter, I think. I just remember the ads when I was a kid for Buck Bumble.
Never heard of this game.
Yeah, this is where it was a weird time. Just gotta freshen my coffee. I'm losing my voice here.
Oh, no.
What do we think the tie-in was with that game and this topic?
I think that he was making a joke. I don't know. I wish Kevin was here to explain it because I still don't get it.
Yeah, like for the record, once again, I'm a video game newbie.
Yeah, I mean,
They're apparently a Ubisoft game.
Sorry, Kevin, can you spell out that joke for me with Buck Bumble and the topic?
A running joke I've tried to have throughout this script is where I mentioned that Grossman's warning us of the dangerous effects of various games, and I'm trying to make it that each one I go to is more obscure than the last.
Oh, okay.
So like Clay Fighter, I think I mentioned Hexen Beyond Heretic.
Oh, I thought you were going to go for games that are like benign, like Tetris or something like that. Tetris is out there. That's why kids are out here bludgeoning each other with geometric
bricks at
shapes.
each other.
Tetris is communist propaganda. You're not going to tell me otherwise.
There's blocks around. It's dangerous.
There's a T-shirt I remember seeing years ago, and I kind of regret not getting it. Which was, it showed, it's got the Russian aesthetic that the arcade game has, and it's got the blocks going down, and it's in the style of a communist propaganda poster, and it says, "With every block, we destroy capitalism."
Okay, that's pretty funny. But can we try a version of that joke with Tetris instead?
Yeah, why not? Okay, so Dave was not the only person who saw his studies as useful to his campaign to protect children against the likes of, those terrifying blocks in Tetris. Various lawmakers cited this kind of research as justification for why video games need to be regulated as a harmful substance like tobacco or alcohol. Take, for example, California's AB 1179, a 2005 bill that banned the sale or rental of violent video games to anyone under the age of 18 and required any video game with violent or sexually explicit content to bear a 2-inch by 2-inch label on the front of the packaging with 18 printed on it to warn parents and retailers of the game's naughty content, with violators subject to a fine of $1,000. Longtime listeners will recall that bill was introduced on February 22nd, 2005, by then California State Assembly member and now convicted arms trafficker Leland Yee. We haven't heard from Leland in a while. Yee cited Indiana University's MRI studies as one of the reasons for the necessity of his bill, writing, quote, exposing minors to depictions of violence in video games, including sexual and heinous violence, makes those minors more likely to experience feelings of aggression, to experience a reduction of activity in the frontal lobes of the brain, and to exhibit violent antisocial or aggressive behavior. Even minors who do not commit acts of violence suffer psychological harm from prolonged exposure to violent video games. The state has a compelling interest in preventing violent, aggressive, and antisocial behavior, and in preventing psychological or neurological harm to minors who play violent video games, end quote. That bill eventually made its all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and for more on that, check out our Brown v. EMA episode. Another element Grossman added to the violent video game conversation is he helped reframe the anxieties over violent video games to better fit his worldview. So, obviously we've seen that before Grossman jumps on the scene, people are anxious about violent video games. We saw it with the panic that led to the creation of the ESRB. But one of the big differences between when Grossman jumps on the scene and when you got people like Eugene Provenzo, the University of Miami education professor, speaking before Congress about video games being, violent, sexist, and racist, is that a lot of the way earlier researchers framed it was kind of like an amorphous anxiety. If the content continues the way it is, people may eventually become more violent. And in fact, one of the talking points at the 1993 violent video game hearings that eventually led to the creation of the ESRB was that there's not enough data to say yet about video games' harmful effects. What Grossman does is he gives it a tangible threat now, whereas previous moral crusaders would say things like, video games, they can desensitize people. They might even lead to more acts of violence. Dave Grossman's contribution to that is he says, video games lead to violence. Video games are what he calls murder simulators, that they actively either train a person to be an effective shooter or psychologically condition someone to overcome that, that natural killing impulse that he claims. And so that's the big contribution that Grossman has. And if you take nothing about his influence over violent video games as a political topic, this is the big thing.
Do you think he's talking more about Beat Saber or Just Dance?
He's talking about Beat Saber, Just Dance, and the harmful effects of Boogie. That's another deep cut.
Boogie, I'm going to have to look that one up.
Boogie was a Wii game, if I recall. He's giving it a tangible thing, and he is the person we get the term murder simulator from. So when you hear other people say that, it starts with him. Again, he talks about this idea a lot, and he also likes to frame it as murderers see everyone as a point, and every person who's trying to kill who's influenced by video games is trying to achieve a high score, is basically the way he frames what video games are doing. As he explained in his 2002 book on combat, quote, is there a kid anywhere who puts his coins into a video game machine, picks up a realistic looking gun, shoots only one virtual person, puts it back down, and then walks away? No, they're trained to kill all the virtual people to rack up a high score. Once a kid makes the decision to cross that tragic invisible line and shoots his girlfriend, he earns 1 point. That's how the video games trained him. If his girlfriend is 1 point, then another kid is a 2nd point. Another garners him a 3rd point, and then he gets a 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and on and on.
Hang on, I want that quote to just go on for a really long time. He gets his 3rd and a 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 457th, 458th, 459th, 460th.
Sometimes when you got a speech, you got a pad for time. It's just all this, counting the number of kills. So once that line is crossed, they all become points, and the kid wants to earn a high score, just as he does in training. The mother of the 13-year-old killer in the Jonesboro school shooting sat across our coffee table and told my wife and I several months after the killings that she finally told her son who he had killed that day. She said her boy laid his head on the table and sobbed, saying, "Those are my friends." There are no friends in violent video games. There are only targets. Points. End quote. Thoughts on that?
Guess he's never played co-op.
It never fails to amaze me that reading through Dave Grossman's things is that how someone could write so much about violent video games and knows so little about video games. Like, say what you will about Jack Thompson, and I've said plenty. Jack Thompson, I think, at least made an effort to immerse himself in whatever media he was railing against. Not to say that he's right, but I think he at very least was able to say, okay, I'm going to look at a video game every once in a while. I don't think Dave ever did that. I think that Dave Grossman, I think he operates on what he thinks a video game is, or what he's had video games described to him as, and then he goes on that incorrect assumption and just runs with it.
Okay, well, not to drive this point home too much, but I mean, even for a noob like me, there's MLB The Show, there's Mario Party, there's stuff that's clearly non-violent. And he doesn't seem to be peeking under the hood of any of those things.
Yeah, I think, Kate, you made an analogy a while back that said that just playing a lot of Madden does not mean you're going to be, an NFL star. Like, I have played a lot of Madden in my time. I do not think I could ever, line up behind center and, do the tush push at the link, I don't think I could do that.
Yeah, I mean, I've played a lot of Cooking Mama, and if I had to make chicken Kiev from scratch, I think I would cry.
That's a game.
Oh, Cooking Mama was wonderful. If you mess up, she disowns you.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
If you screw up, like as you're chopping and boiling and stuff, and if you mess up, she just yells, "You're not mine."
Oh my God. Listen, I'm trying to find a form of escapism here, not going back to my childhood.
Kevin,
good.
Before we lose the thread on Cooking Mama, we're not alone in thinking she was saying "you are not mine." Apparently, she is saying "do not mind."
What?
It's like, it's okay. Don't mind.
Oh,
you're supposed to be a child. You're supposed to be a little kid who she's teaching how to cook.
Oh, that's sweet. Thanks, Cooking Mama.
I mean, that's more heartening because to steal part of your joke, Phil, that's how I learned how to cook when I was a kid. I'll never forget. And I got into cooking when I was in college, and my mom liked to cook too. And I remember one time going home and we were making dinner together, and I had to boil like instant rice or something. And I always just kind of eyeball it, you know these things. It's like the packets. You put in a saucepan, you put some water, and you boil it. And my mother says, like, you have to put a cup in there. And I just kind of eyeball it. I said, it's fine. It's going to boil off. And I'll never forget this. She takes the saucer, unbreaking eye contact with me, looking at me the whole time. She takes that saucepan that I had on the stove, looks straight in the eye, and dumped it right in the sink. And that moment, I realized that my mother and I like to cook. We connect a lot on cooking and baking, but we cannot share the same kitchen.
Duly noted.
Yeah. Thank you, Cooking Mama.
Well, just speaking of which, I'm posting I don't know how true this is, and I'm not going to take the time right now. There was a rumor in 2020 that there was crypto mining hijacking code in the Cooking Mama game for the Nintendo Switch.
Jesus Christ almighty.
Hijack your machine's processor power. I posted the link. You might want to look into this for like a little episode at some point.
Maybe we do a follow-up to crypto at some point. Thanks for sharing that.
Cooking Mama? More like Cooking Miner.
We are going to do at some point the I don't know if you're familiar, Phil. I think I know you are, Kate, the PETA games. So PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, in the late 2000s and early 2010s, commissioned a bunch of Flash games, which were parodies of mainstream games, and were basically designed to illustrate, animal cruelty. And I think often we're just designed as publicity stunts. So like there was one of you play as Mario with a Tanuki suit, and it's about the fur industry. So like you're like ripping the skin off of an animal and putting it on you. There was Pokemon Black and Blue, which is basically that you beat up the trainers and you free all the Pokemon. And there was a Cooking Mama one that talked about the cruelty of eating meat, in which you had to prepare a turkey dinner, and it shows you cutting the turkey's head off and like its blood going everywhere and stripping its feathers, interspersed with actual photographs of like animals being, killed and processed. And Cooking Mama has like the angriest anime eyes you've ever seen. We will cover them at some point because they are wild. I think that's a pretty good note to end on, because that pretty much wraps up everything I wanted to cover regarding Dave Grossman's first prong in his war on video games, that being information. And so next time, we'll pivot towards the other two, legislation and litigation. And along the way, we're going to be in contact again with an old friend of the show. And that will do it for today's episode of Scandalous Games. If you like what we're doing and want to help the show, subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. If you want to learn more, check out our website, scandalousgamespodcast.wordpress.com, where I publish the show notes and the sources for every episode. Our theme music is Occam's Seek Me by Seek Knowledge via the Free Music Archive, used under a CC BY NCSA 3.0 US license. If you have a question, comment, or idea for a topic for a future episode, email us at scandalousgamespodcast@gmail.com. And until next time, I'm Kevin Impellizeri.
I'm Bill Thomas.
I'm Kate.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next Scandal. Subscribe to Fat Roll Gaming on YouTube.